What's up folks, Jeff Everhart here. In this video, we'll explore how to build a custom in-app feed using Knock's JavaScript client. I've modeled this project visually on the Notion in-app feed, and we'll use Next.js and shadcn UI to build out the interface. In this video, we'll look at how to configure an in-app channel and workflow in Knock, and then fetch a user's feed from the Feed API and update message engagement statuses as a user marks things read and archived. Finally, we'll explore some of the small details that make Notion's feed just so good. So let's get started. Before we get too deep, I just wanted to show you what the end product was going to look like. We'll end up with a tabbed feed that looks like this, where users can mark things as read, mark them as archived, and then switch between these different views of the feed. Now, this whole example project can be downloaded from the Knock Labs GitHub account in the Notion feed example repo. This has two branches, the main branch, which is basically the finished version, and the start branch, which is what I'll be starting with for this project and walking you through how to add the functionality to read from the Feed API and update those message engagement statuses. So I went ahead and cloned the repository from the GitHub repo that you can find in the video description. And the first thing that I'm going to do is make a copy of my env file. So I've went ahead and switched to the start branch, and then we'll go ahead and type cp.env.sample, and we'll copy that into an env.local file. And then we can open that up and see what values we're going to need, because there are a few things that we'll want to retrieve from the Knock dashboard. So we'll need a Knock user ID, a knockFeed channel ID, and a public API key. So let's hop back into Knock and figure out where those values are stored. The first thing we'll grab is our API key. So under the developers.api keys heading, we can come down here and we're going to go ahead and copy this public key, hop back into our code editor, and just save that there. Now we'll also need our feed channel ID. So if we come up to integrations, find the in-app channel feed that gets created automatically, or another one that you've created as a part of your own projects, we can go ahead and copy that ID and paste that into our environment file as well. Now we'll also come back in here and we will also need a user. So I have a bunch of pre-provisioned users that I've already created, and we're going to use Stephen Martz Sr. for this. So I'll go ahead and copy the ID of that user and paste that into my env file. So now I should be all ready to go as long as I've installed the project's dependencies. If I go ahead and fire up npm run dev, this should start my local server on localhost 3000. If I click this link to follow it, we should see that we get a project that looks like this. Right now, there's nothing in either of these tabs, and our inbox basically says that we don't have any messages, and that's what we'll be adding in the next couple of steps. Okay, so before we go any further, let's hop back into the Knock dashboard, and let's take a look at one of our in-app workflows. So we can see here that I've got just a really basic in-app workflow. If I click into the workflow itself and go to the workflow editor canvas, we can see that I've got just sort of a really basic message template here, just saying, hey, we completed this activity. And so let's go ahead and seed a bunch of messages. So we'll click run a test. We've got our user ID right here. We've got the actor set to my Gmail address. And then we'll go ahead and pass in a different message as our new message, and then just click run test a couple of times to seed that in-app feed with some stuff that we can work with. Now this example app doesn't actually go through the sending part or triggering of workflows. It's really just showing you how to read from that in-app feed. So that'll have to be something that you explore on your own and use some of our other example apps in the docs to figure out. And so now that we have a couple of different example messages in this in-app feed for our user, let's hop back into the code editor and figure out how we can go about reading that user's feed API. So let's hop back into VS Code. Okay, So the first thing that we'll want to do is open up our activity feed component. and then we'll configure a new instance of the Knock client. So we can see that we're already importing a couple of things from the knocklabs/client package, which should have been installed as a dependency in your project already. Now we'll come over here right below FeedItemCard and we'll create a new constant variable called knockClient. This is going to store a new configured instance of the client. So I'll say new knock, and then inside of here we'll do process.env, hop out to our env.local file and copy the name of this environment variable. And then we'll just go ahead and say as string to satisfy TypeScript here. And then right below that, since we've created a new instance of the Knock client, we also need to authenticate it by passing a user ID. So we'll just say knockClient.authenticate, and then here we'll pass in our user ID environment variable, which is called next public knock user ID. So we'll go ahead and do that and just say as string. And then right below that, now that we've created a new instance of the client, we've authenticated, we'll initialize a new feed. And so we'll create a new variable. This is going to be called knockFeed. And so this will be equal to knockClient.feeds.initialize. And then inside of this, this is going to take two different arguments. The first is going to be the feed channel, right? So we're going to tie this to the feed channel ID that we got in the first step. So we'll pass that in as an environment variable and say, we'll do that as string. And then the second option, which is optional, are feed client options. And so there's two things that we're going to include here. The first is going to be page size, which we'll set to 20. This is just how many items it's going to grab at one time. And then we're also going to say archived, and we're going to set that to include. So this way we're going to get the most recent 20 items of our feed and include our archived items in there as well. So we'll go ahead and save that out. And in the next step, we'll talk about how we can actually fetch items from that feed and then tie those into the user interface. Okay, to begin the process of fetching, I'm going to go ahead and delete this feed items variable for now. And what we're going to start with is by declaring some new constant variables. And this is going to be feed and set feed. Because these are going to be useState variables. So we'll declare, a new useState hook. And then inside of here, we're going to go ahead and just do some typing now. So we're going to tell it that this is a feed store state type, which we're importing from the knocklabs client package. And then we'll just initialize this to an empty object. And then again, just sort of tell TypeScript what this is going to look like. And then we'll go ahead and use quick fix to add that missing import from React. So right below that, we've got this useState hook, which we're going to use to set some local state for this component. But we also want to basically make some network calls using the knockFeed to load the initial state of our feed and then listen for some updates. So we'll use another React hook to do that, and we'll open up a useEffect. And then inside of this, we'll go ahead and just stub that out. And let's see, we're going to pass that also just this empty array for right now. And so inside of this useEffect, the first thing that we're going to do is on knockFeed, we're going to call listen for updates. And so what that does is that basically creates the webhook connection, the WebSocket connection with the API, so that when we get real-time updates, the feed is open to listening to those. So then what we'll do also down here is we're just going to open up a new function. So we're going to say const fetch feed is equal to this async anonymous function. And then inside of this function, we're going to await knockFeed.fetch. And this is going to make just a sort of a regular old HTTP call out to get the initial items of that feed. And then once we've done that, we're going to extract the feed state. So we'll say const feed state equals knockFeed.getState. And then we'll take that initial feed state and use our setFeed function from our useState hook and initialize it to that feed state. So that's what that function does. And now we need to come down here and we actually need to call it inside of our useEffect hook. So we'll go ahead and call fetchFeed right below that. And then there's also one other thing that we want to do inside of this event listener. So what we've done here, let's take a recap real quick. So we've used useState to create some local state variables for this activity feed component. Inside of this useEffect hook, we're asking the knockFeed client to listen for real-time updates. Then we're basically creating this function to fetch the feed initially. Then right here, we're fetching it where we go out, we fetch the feed, and then we set the state that we get back to our local component state. But there's one additional thing that we need to do, and that's add an event listener to the knockFeed so that when we do get those real-time updates from this listen for updates function, we can reconcile those updates with our local state. So what we'll do down here is on the knockFeed, we'll call the on method, and then we'll pass it this string of items.receive.realtime. And then the second argument for this is just going to be a regular function. So we'll pass in an arrow function. And then inside of here, we'll just basically do the same thing that we did above that. So we're going to get the state of the feed and then set it into our local state. So we'll go ahead and call knockFeed.getState and pass that into setFeed. And so what this does is basically the knockFeed kind of does a really good job already of managing its own internal state. And so there are a couple of other ways that you can use our JavaScript packages. The JavaScript client obviously is made to be independent of any one framework. But we have hooks and other things that are specific to React that you could use here. But we wanted to build this example just to show you basically the vanilla JavaScript functionality. Okay, so what this is doing is the knockFeed does a good job of keeping track of its own internal state. And so when there are changes to that internal state, we're just going to reconcile those with the state in React by calling setFeed and just sort of overwriting whatever feed was in that local variable. Okay, so now we've got a pretty good handle on actually getting those items from the API. And in the next step, what we'll do is make those items available to the interface, and then we can actually render some different components. Okay, and before we proceed, I'm actually going to make one quick update to this event type. Instead of it being items.receiveRealTime, we're just going to do items.star. And so that just captures a wider array of changes that can happen to the knockFeed. This could be items.receive.realtime. And if we kind of look at the other options that we have here, you can see here that we've got items received, page received, and this really items.all just sort of encapsulates all of these different events. So even as we start updating the message engagement statuses on these items, we'll see that reflected, and this event trigger will fire and sort of help us reconcile our state as we make a variety of different changes to the feed. Okay, so we can see here that we've also got this archived items array. And what we're going to want to do, right? So if we reference back to our user interface, we can see that we've got like a couple of different options here, right? We've got the inbox, which is pretty much things that aren't archived. We've got this archive tab, and we've got this all tab. So what we're going to want to do is sort of separate these things out and create different arrays for these different types of items. And so what we'll use to do that is we'll go ahead and create some new constant variables, and we'll call this just feed items. And then we'll call this archived items. And then what we'll do is we'll use the useMemo hook to basically compute some of these values for us every time that array changes. And so what we'll do here is we'll open up this, and then in our dependency array, we'll go ahead and pass in the feed so that every time this changes, we can re-update those values. So the first thing that we'll do in here is let's open up some space here. useMemo, we'll import that from React. And we know that those values aren't read yet, but that's okay. So the first thing we'll do is create our array of feed items. So we'll just say const feed items, and I realize now we need to pluralize this. So we'll say feed items equals, feed dot items, and then we'll say dot filter, and we'll return basically, we'll pass in this item, right? So this is going to be our feed item. It's going to be of type feed item. So we can use some TypeScript typing there. And then basically what we're going to want to do here is return, if this item has not been archived yet. So we'll just say item archived at doesn't exist, right? So if it hasn't been archived yet, that's how we're going to generate this feed items. And then we'll come down here and I'll just copy this code because we're just going to sort of modify that for archived items. So we'll call this archived items. And we'll set that to, if it has been archived basically. And then down here, we're going to return this array. And the first item is going to be feed items. Then the second item is going to be archived items. Okay, so cool. All that stuff looks good. And now in the next step, we can actually turn this array of feed items and archived items into user interface elements. Okay, so let's implement this list of just regular feed items. So this is basically what we would find in the user's inbox. If we scroll down here into our tabbed content, we can see that basically we're going to implement that right here. And so the first thing we'll do is we'll just open up some curly braces and we're going to do a little bit of a conditional check. So we're going to make sure that feed items.length is greater than 1. And if it is, we're going to return a feed item card. Well, so actually we're not going to return this wholesale, but let's get some other stuff set up real quick. So let's open up that. And then basically, if not, we're going to want to return this div down here. And so we can go ahead and enter that right now. And let's see if we can, clear that up. All right. And so inside of here, if feed items length is greater than 1, then we're going to want to map through the feed items. So we'll say feed items.map. And then each one of those is going to take an item that's going to be, let's do another. Let's say this is an item and it's going to be type feed item. And then down here, let's see, we're going to want to pass in our arrow function. And then this is going to return some JSX. And this JSX element is actually going to be our feed item card. And the feed item card is going to have a couple of different props on it. So the first one is going to be a key, which is just going to be the item.id. And then it'll also take an item, which is our feed item. So we'll say that's our item. And then it will also take the knockFeed. So we're going to pass this knockFeed down into this feed items component so that we can actually make some of those adjustments to message engagement statuses directly on our feed. And we'll take a second and go and look at what the feed item card looks like here in just a second. So we'll pass in the knockFeed into this as well. We'll go ahead and save it. And let's see. And yeah, let's do some conditional stuff here. All right, and then let's hop out into our interface and see what that looks like. Great, and so we can see that this is doing exactly what we want. Everything's working as we would expect. Right now, there's still nothing in our archive tab, but we see now that we're loading this feed and we're getting all of these different feed messages and passing those down into the feed item card appropriately. Now, there are a couple of other changes that we're going to want to make here, including updating this, badge count right here. So let's hop back into our code real quick and let's find where that badge lives. It's going to live up in the tab. So if we come over here, we're going to look at the badge count. Okay, and to modify this badge count, we'll open up some curly brackets, and then we're going to go ahead and basically check to see whether or not our feed is loading. And if it is, we're just not going to display that badge count. But if it's not loading, meaning that it's loading already, and there's a couple of different states that this feed client has, we're going to go ahead and display this badge. But then instead of displaying a hard-coded number, we'll sort of dig into this and display the metadata. And then if it has metadata, we'll go ahead and try to access the unread count. And let's go ahead and hop back into our user interface and see what that looks like. Okay, so we can see there that, hey, this is loading for a second. That badge doesn't get displayed. And then if we go ahead and update some of these message statuses by marking this item as read, you can see that we have a number of interface changes that happen, but also that badge count updates. So cool. All of those interactions are handled by the FeedItemCard, which we'll dig into in just a second. So let's actually hop back into the code, and we went ahead and rendered our feed items down here. Let's do something similar with our archived items tab. And so we'll go ahead and actually just copy this for a second. Really, we'll just copy this sort of outer map, and we're just going to go ahead and grab this, and we'll open some curly braces in here. Because we can just leave this empty, and if archived items are there, we'll map them into feed item cards. And then let's hop back into here and let's see if that makes a difference. All right, sweet. We can see some of our archived items there. And like say, for example, we want to archive this item. We can do that, and that should update, and we can see that there. And this is an interesting thing about the message engagement statuses, at least as Knock creates them, is that they are mutually inclusive, which means that they can be multiple different states all at one time. So this is unread and archived, which is very interesting, and it gives you a lot of flexibility as the developer in how you want to model these engagement statuses in your own application, because you can certainly do this differently, right? And so when I go to mark this as archived, I could also mark it as read or seen or whatever sort of combination you want to have there. So the feed item card is doing a lot of heavy lifting in this little example app. So let's hop back into VS Code and explore that component for just a second. So we can look at the props that it takes, and it takes in our feed item and the knockFeed. And then inside of that, we do a number of things. So the first is that we extract the different blocks that are attached to that feed item. And we're pulling out the body, which is basically the message template that we created as a part of our workflow. So we can see the body right there. If we click on this in-app feed step and open up our message template, basically that's the body of this particular notification. So that's the first thing we do. Then down here, we're also doing some conditional rendering. And this is something we'll skip and I'll kind of get to at the end, because these are some of the really cool things that Notion does to make a really nice in-app feed experience. But secondly, we're kind of looping through the items actors, right? These are the people who are generating the notification, triggering the workflow and Knock by their action, and we're sort of creating that heading. Here you can see how we're rendering this date into a particular locale, using this toLocaleDate string function and using the item.insertedAt property. And then down here is where we're actually dealing with the message engagement statuses. So here, if the item has already been read, we're basically going to, if it hasn't been read, we're going to render this particular button, right? And this is our markAllAsRead button. You can see here that we got just a bunch of conditional rendering for these things to decide which button to display. So if we hop back into our interface, right, we've got our markAllAsRead, our archive button. Then, if we change that, we can see that the type of button that's getting displayed there changes. And so this is how we sort of toggle that read status. And this archive and then restore archive functionality is how we toggle that for that particular message status. So there you can see that sort of conditional rendering that we're doing. And the reason that we're passing in the knockFeed client is just so we can attach each one of those on-click handlers to a particular method on the knockFeed, right? So we have got knockFeed.markAsArchived, knockFeed.markAsUnarchived, where we just pass in the item, and then the knockFeed handles updating the internal state of the feed to represent that status change, and then also making an API request. It's worth noting that it does that optimistically, where it updates the internal state of the feed and then makes the API request. But we can see that that works pretty much the same as this knockFeed.markAsRead, knockFeed.markAsUnread. And the way that those work is that feed updates for us locally inside of our activity feed component because of this event listener that we set here in our useEffect hook, right? We told the knockFeed to listen to basically any of those lower level item changes and then reset our feed state. So that's what's happening there, and that's sort of how that works. Okay, and so there are a couple of other pieces of functionality that I think we want to build into this thing. If we look at our inbox experience, we've got this markAllAsRchived and archive all button that we want to tie in there as well. And so to do that, we'll hop back into our activity feed component. And I've got these two functions that I'm just going to paste from off screen to sort of keep the video a little bit shorter. And that's what we're going to do is we're just going to create a markAllAsRead function and then set our feed state manually and do the same with the markAllAsArchived. And then we should be able to come down here into our component, and then we'll just go ahead and add an on-click handler here, and we'll pass that an anonymous function. And then inside of that, we'll just call, actually, we should just be able to pass markAllAsRead, and we'll do the same thing down here and pass that one markAllAsArchived. So we'll save that out. Let's hop back into our interface and see if that actually works. All right, cool there, great. We've got markAllAsRead, and if we wanted to markAllAsArchived, we can see that we can really quickly clear out our notification feed. So let's restore a couple of these things because there are a couple of things that I want to talk about that I think Notion does that just add this extra layer of polish to an in-app feed experience. The first one is this sort of new unread icon. So let's hop back into this and go into our FeedItemCard because we can see that we're basically rendering that right here. So if the item has a read at property that's not null, we're going to render, or sorry, if it is null, we're going to render that new icon component. And if it isn't, we're going to render null, right? So we're just not going to render anything. We sort of created that down here, and we can see that this is just a div, right? With some additional styling applied to it. It's got this 8-inch height or 8 pixel height, 8 pixel width. And then we've got this background, and it's positioned absolutely sort of relative to that containing feed card. And I basically cribbed all these styles one-to-one from Notion, and then also had to sort of mess a little bit with the left and top properties on this particular UI element because the avatar size was a little bit different. But again, this is just one of those really nice features that calls some attention to an unread item in a feed. And so if I go ahead and mark both of these as read, we can see there that there's another treatment that Notion applies to these particular feed items that I think is just really classy. And if we hop back into our FeedItemCard, we'll take a look at what that is. And it's basically just applying a 70% opacity to the element whenever it's marked as read. But you can see how when we look at the interface, it just sort of de-emphasizes those things that we've already interacted with and makes the things that we haven't stand out much more. Because we've got both these sort of double encoding of this unread status. We've got this new item little icon displaying right here. And then instead of being 70% opacity, it's 100% opacity. And so it just, when you compare these things against each other, they both just stand out really well. And I think they're really tasteful affordances that Notion builds into this in-app feed experience. Awesome. Thanks so much for watching. In this video, we covered how to build an in-app feed experience inspired by Notion using Knock's vanilla JavaScript client. We covered how to create an in-app feed channel and workflow, fetching items from a user's feed, and managing engagement statuses on feed messages. The feed client gives developers pretty much unlimited flexibility in the types of experiences they can create, so I'm excited to see what you'll build. Thanks for watching, and knock on.